My name is Evan Patrick Maloney. I'd like to thank Stephanie for inviting me today, and I'd also like to thank Kari Horowitz, who is a librarian at RIT, for getting me in touch with Stephanie in the first place. I'm a third-year photography major at RIT, and it's a really great opportunity to speak here today. During one of my first photography courses at RIT, our professor, Susan McWhinney, presented the class with a slide that looked a lot like this. She asked us if we knew at all what it was, and after some confused responses of code or like computer language, she told us that it was a picture. It was the back end of a JPEG image of her dog. She explained to us that all digital files today are just data, just ones and zeros. Throughout that first year of my photography education at RIT, Susan stressed the importance of computer and data literacy across the board, often saying that illiteracy would soon come to mean not knowing how to code. These ideas had a strong impact on me, and while I continued studying traditional photography, I also explored the world of computer science and how I could apply my own methods, apply its methods to my practice. As I learned more about programming and code, I was also absorbing as much contemporary art in that scene as I could. I found that many artists were already working with computer technology and data already. I learned of Brian House, who transforms data like his personal geolocation and even the conductivity of a mine's drainage fluid into ambient electronic music. I found Lewis Bush, who also works with sound, transforming encrypted government radio transmissions into these colorful patterns for everyone to openly view. And then I also learned of the work of Melanie Wilhide, which was made when she recovered a hard drive's worth of deleted files from her stolen laptop. All these artists and many more had a strong impression on how I thought about data and art, and how basically anything I made as a contemporary artist would at some point exist as a string of data for a computer to sort out. But I am and was a photographer at heart. So when I started to really think about how I wanted to personally work with these ideas, I began at the beginning. Man Ray's work centered around technology as well, and how our perception of what our perception of a photograph could be in the 20th century. To create his photograms, which these two are right here, what he called rayograms, he didn't use a camera, only an enlarger, light-sensitive paper, and random bits and bobs that he put on top. He made these solarized prints by altering what would otherwise be considered bad darkroom procedure. All of his work, though, was created through experimenting with the foundations of photography he had at the time, which were light, form, paper, and chemicals. I decided that I would experiment with the contemporary building blocks of photography. We have code, computers, and digital software. I started my process by finding the best way to strip digital pictures down to their bare bones or the raw data, like the second slide that I showed. I learned about Audacity, a free and open source audio software that you can download on any Mac or PC. Beyond being a normal digital audio workstation, Audacity has the built-in ability to import and export files as raw headerless information. You can import a JPEG, and Audacity can ignore what the header of the file normally indicates what it's supposed to do with that data, and read it as if it were a sound. Almost since programs like this were capable of importing different files beyond normal MP3s and waves, artists and innovators have been importing the wrong files. I learned this technique is often referred to now as data bending. These are some of my early works in this process. Data bending is usually defined as taking digital files and manipulating them in a way that was not originally intended for that file type. These processes produce glitchy, sometimes abstract results, as I think is kind of apparent. This is a picture I took in Central Park a couple years ago, and it was just a picture I took from my hard drive. By applying effects that are normally meant for sound, like echo and pitch shift, I could visualize what these effects normally do to the sound files visually. But even after I had experimented with all the various effects Audacity has to offer, I wasn't really satisfied. I could produce very similar effects in Photoshop. And when I thought about it, there was really no difference between editing this picture in an audio software and manipulating it in a similar way in a digital image software. I was creating kind of weird, funky image filters in a pretty roundabout way and wanted to move past that. So I continued experimenting. I thought more about the second step of processing an image in Audacity. To data bend an image, like the ones I showed before, you need to export that file from Audacity as raw headerless information because Audacity does not have a JPEG or TIFF export out option. You then take that raw headerless information and import it into a raw converter like Photoshop's Camera Raw to make an image again in Photoshop. I thought that if this process worked with sound files, or where it worked with image files coming into Audacity, that would probably work with files that Audacity was normally used to, like MP3s or waves. I could convert the sound data to raw data and then make Photoshop interpret that as long as I gave it the right parameters. So, again, like Man Ray reaching for like his keys or the random bits and bobs around his studio, I went to files that were already on my hard drive. I converted every song of the 1996 Cake album Fashion Nugget to raw data and sent them through Photoshop. These are the images made from all of the 14 songs in order. While working through the album, which is sometimes a tedious process of importing and exporting and converting, I started thinking more about the ways we listen to music today and the evolution of consumer audio products. We went from the analog record to listening to digital files streaming right onto our phones really rather quickly. But I see the compact disc, like the CD I downloaded these songs from originally, as being an odd but really important link between the two worlds of analog records and purely digital files. CDs were physical objects that you put in a player, like a record, but contain only digital information, the same MP3s we listen to on iTunes or Spotify. The images speak to that link, I think, emphasizing the presence of digital information in even the most concrete of objects. And just to show too a little bigger, this one is Going the Distance, which was the hit single of the album. And this one here is Childish Gambino's Redbone, which was a hit a couple of years ago. And after I played with that process for a while, I kept experimenting with new things, and at the same time, I was developing a mild interest in electronic music and music synthesis. I downloaded this free and open source modular synthesizer emulator called VCV Rack and stumbled through the large expanse that is making your own electronic sound. It wasn't long before I started making images from the sounds I made in Rack. I could visualize the differences in the sound through the differences in the final images. I found that regular, unmodulated tones produce pretty regular, predictable patterns, like this one, and this one. And I found that heavily modulated frequencies and lots of frequencies overlaid on top of each other produced very unpredictable, busy images, like this one here. I saw this process as similar to light painting in photography, except I shape the source of my pictures from digital synthesis instead of light from a strobe or flashlight. And just to make these large again, because I have the opportunity to. These were three of my favorite images that I made around that time. And then one spring break, about 2 years ago, I was helping my neighbor set up a new digital heart rate monitor that he had bought. He was using it to track his heart rate as well as his speed and elevation while cycling. An app on his phone displayed all the information in easy-to-read big numbers. Through the app, his heartbeat became a string of information next to all the other measurements. His heartbeat became data. I went home and ordered a stethoscope from Amazon, which I found to be quite a bit more affordable than a similar heart rate monitor. With a contact mic taped to one end, I recorded my own heartbeat through the stethoscope and processed the recording as an image, which I have up here. Since then, I have continued to realize that everything in our lives, down to the fundamental frequency produced by our heartbeat, can be interpreted by someone as data. This digital information can be used to our benefit, as the cycling app that tells my neighbor when he is pushing too hard on his bike, but often it is reinterpreted for someone else's gain. It is extremely difficult today to prevent others from profiting off the data that we make by just living. And I might not be able to stop my personal data from being commodified, but by making art like this from the digital information that I create is a way of saying that this data is still mine. And then to conclude, I know it was a little fast, I wanted to show some more of my recent experiments in this area. I'm always creating new things, whether I really know the direction they're headed or not. So right now, I'm working on putting some of the images I showed today and some newer ones back into a time-based medium. So I'm starting to set the images back along with the sound that they create them in time. So this is my heartbeat again, created in this very long strip of pixels in Photoshop instead of the square. And then I export that as a bunch of little squares that then I set as frames in Premiere to make a moving video. And I just want to say a quick warning that this video, and especially the video on the next slide, contain really fast, colorful, flashing images. So if anyone needs to step out or prefer that I not play them. Okay. So this is my heartbeat. this last slide was made in a very similar way to the heartbeat, but I have to admit that this one's a little more self-indulgent. I made this last semester, late one night, experimenting again, working off of files that I had like right at hand, and I've wanted to see it like big like this for forever. So I'm gonna. Yes.
And so your community has a strong link with the deaf community.
Yes.
A part of your So are you collaborating or using or thinking about, in a sense, you have a visual representation of sound.
Yeah.
I imagine that people that cannot hear sound might be interested in seeing those representations.
I've thought about it. I know there's definitely a synesthetic aspect to this work. I haven't gotten in touch with anyone because I know that might be a touchy subject for some people. Because I have talked to some people in the deaf community, not specifically about this work, but just in like happenstance. And a lot of the deaf community, especially at RIT, will talk about how they do experience music as not just visual, but they can feel the frequencies. So I don't want to inadvertently insult anyone by saying that this representation of a sound is for them to now experience when they couldn't have experienced it before, because they can. So I do want to talk to people, but I want to be a little bit careful about it.
Okay, thank you. I am aware of this. I'm not thinking about, okay, this is a complete substitution. You should go
Yeah,
this
for
route.
sure.
But it's something that can enrich the experience.
Layer.
Yeah.
All the sense. You can feel it, but you can see it.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, interesting.
Yeah, I've just wanted to be, I've been hesitant.
No, perfect. Thank you.
I have a question.
Mhm.
So when you have that raw headerless data, do you know anything about the choices the software is making about when to stop its parsing of something? So like say, I'm imagining that such and such strings translates in Photoshop to that yellow, but like when does it keep going and make that orange? And can you, like when you're looking at that raw data, can you pull or play with that?
I've dived into that a little bit, and I have to say that my software knowledge is not great. So it's just been me trying to like, either isolate frequencies or isolate length of the data that I input to see what the output is, like a very basic like scientific method of seeing what is created. So I haven't looked at the software or the data super closely to find stuff like that. I can set certain parameters for Photoshop to, if I go back, when I import the data initially, I have all of these parameters to tell Photoshop how to interpret the data. And to make a lot of the images today, I'll set the dimensions as some sort of square, do 3 channels to produce color, and not interleave those channels, because that leads to not as like visually pleasing images, just because the data gets way too jumbled. And then usually 8 or 16 bits to make it either more or less colorful. That also, I'm restricted in that sense by the initial size of the file, because I can make like 15 seconds of audio into a 16-bit image, but it might only be 250 by 250 pixels. I can make it larger by decreasing the bit depth a little bit.
Cool.
Yeah. Yes?
I guess one comment and then a question. I'm interested in the inconsistencies, and you talked a little bit about noise, and I don't know. I was thrown back to seeing my heart beating in a sonogram,
Yeah.
and being upset when I saw it that it wasn't doing it exactly the same way every time.
Yeah.
And so those differences between each beat, I guess I just find them intriguing. That is,
Yeah.
that I guess it's a different sort of noise, right? And there's a different kind of margins of noise and what is acceptable and what falls outside of it, right? But the question more is that can you envision any way that any of this can be translated backwards, right? Is there any means of, by someone else, I guess is what I'm saying. Is that a possibility, or can it be presented or organized in a way that it could be?
So I make the sound, make it an image, and then someone else downloads the image and gets the original sound.
Yeah, or well, not necessarily the original, right? In other words, the kind of interpretation. Of
Yeah.
Right?
I've experimented with that as well, and have found that no matter how close I make the dimensions, because sometimes I'll input all this information and Photoshop will give me a warning that says the parameters that I set create a file that doesn't use all of the data that is available. And I found that even when I get as close to that threshold as possible, Photoshop cuts off something. Whether that, sometimes that is just a channel of the sound. So I'll get lower or higher frequencies in the output sound when I bring it back into Audacity, or it cuts off like the end or the beginning or a chunk in the middle.
So that's something that's accepted in the idea of translation. That is the loss of.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, as you know, I think this work is fantastic. What's interesting to me when I was listening to you talk about it here is how you rooted in photography, right? Because the end product, I think, doesn't signify photography very clearly. You just came to the end product. So the question I was playing with as I watched and listened at the same time was, how much do you think the end visual products rely on the sense of it having to be a translation, right? Like, so I think there's a very clear difference between walking up to something like this in a gallery space or on a screen and maybe watching it move, but also hearing what it's coming from. How much do you think the work relies on the interplay, the kind of multisensory aspect? Or do you think that you can experience just the visual part in isolation?
Yeah, I think for some of it, I don't care about it being a translation. Like for these, I was making sounds on my computer specifically to make images out of. Like I would make a sine wave and modulate it in a certain way to try to make like a really even composition. And so there, the sounds were really like the light of photography, like the base source of what the final image was going to be. And so I feel fine just presenting these as the final image and maybe not even mentioning that they came from sound. That's just the process that I used. But for something like this, where it's my heartbeat, I think the idea of translation becomes more important, and knowing the source material that went into making an image is important, because it speaks to the idea of all of what we do now is data that can be interpreted and reinterpreted and shared and sold. And I wanted to do that in a way that produces something that's like visually beautiful or striking, or that I personally like to look at. It's like taking back like agency over those things. So I think translation is really important there, knowing that background.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you.